Good morning, and welcome to this presentation by Social Venture Partners Dallas. My name is Tony Fleo, and I serve as the CEO of the organization. Social Venture Partners is made up of people who come together to support and to provide support to nonprofits and for-profit, for-good businesses in our community from a capacity building perspective. So they bring their professional skills, their financial resources, and their business acumen to help organizations grow so that they can achieve their missions in greater force. We have been presenting these digital gatherings since the pandemic first started, well over a year ago now. And we have been focused on bringing conversations that help our audience understand, much like our own work at Social Venture Partners, what are the most innovative ways to solve some of society's most difficult problems. I was first struck by this conversation in an article that I read in the New York Times about the work of these folks that we are going to be introducing here in a moment. And then later, once again, I heard the conversation on NPR as they were featured there. So I am delighted to bring them here to our local audience in Dallas, just to lift up an example of what can be done, what are some of the positive, innovative responses to the racial crisis that we have in our country that is ongoing. It is an important conversation on this, the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And so I want to welcome our panelists this morning. I would like to welcome Joseph Stewart. Joseph is the acting president of the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation and co-chair of the GU 272 Foundation Leadership Committee. He's a fifth-generation grandson of Isaac Hawkins, a Jesuit enslaved man. Joe is a retired senior vice president of corporate affairs and chief ethics officer of Kellogg Company in Battle Creek, Michigan. He was a trustee of the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and chaired the board for 2 years. He is co-founder and CEO of Stewart Industries, LLC. My next guest is Father Timothy Kozecki. He is the president of the Jesuit Conference of Canada and the United States, headquartered in Washington, D.C. The Jesuit Conference promotes common goals and oversees international projects for the Society of Jesus. As conference president, Father Kozecki works with the Jesuit provincials of the United States and Canada in implementing programs and represents the conference internationally. Prior to leading the Jesuit Conference, Father Kozecki served from 2008 to 2014 as the provincial of the Chicago-Detroit province of the Society of Jesus. From 2000 to 2008, he served as president of St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, Ohio. Mr. Stewart joins us from Florida. Father Kozecki joins us from Washington, D.C. Welcome to Dallas. Thank you for being with us this morning on this historic day. And we are grateful for the work that you are doing and for the work that you have done as your life's work. Mr. Stewart, I would like to turn it over to you. And, just in listening to some of the sessions that you have been on and in our conversations, you are a most inspiring man. And I am grateful that you would take time to be with our audience today. Tell us a little bit about how all of this came about and how you got engaged in this particular aspect of your work.
Let me begin, Tony, by thanking you. It is indeed a privilege for Father Kozecki and me to be with Social Venture Partners Dallas. We are pleased to share the story of the Descendant Jesuit Partnership, for we believe our unique partnership for truth and reconciliation in America is offering all people of goodwill a unique pathway forward in the much needed pursuit of justice and equality in our country. But if you'll allow me, before getting into the details of our journey, allow me a few minutes to share some inner thoughts that are coming directly from my heart to the hearts of those in the audience. I hope you will accept these. I sit before you today as a 78-year-old Black man, a fifth-generation descendant of Jesuit and Catholic enslavement in my beloved country by my beloved religion. My grandpa's name is Isaac Hawkins. He headed the list of enslaved men, women, and children who were sold in 1838 to plantation owners in Louisiana. The plight of my grandpa in the 18th century and the plight of Black Americans in the 21st century have little to do with the content of our character. It is mostly to do with the pigmentation of our skin. I am here with you today with heartfelt emotions about this truth and about the state of our one humanity. I hope you will embrace my truth today. The truth that for all of my 78 years, I have lived with both subtle and not so subtle fear. Fear in a country my ancestors helped build. I have lived knowing the ultimate truth, the truth that our common creator made us all brothers and sisters in his one and only one humankind. Despite the harsh realities that Blacks are facing and forced to endure in America, I am encouraged by your choice to bring attention to the first anniversary of the brutal murder of Mr. George Floyd. It seems to me Social Venture Partners is using this occasion to help us see the truth about the ugly and shameful aspect of who we are as a country and what do we aspire to be as a country. Your recognition of injustice against Mr. Floyd is a challenge to each of us, a challenge to become better human beings, a challenge to help us recognize the pressing need to heal our nation and to build a more kind and more gentle America. Just 1 year ago, as the last 9 minutes and 29 seconds of Mr. Floyd's life was being taken away by the remnants of the legacy of slavery and unmitigated racism in our country, most of the world simply watched in total belief that they were looking at a scene in America. What we witnessed was the truth of 400 years of dehumanization of some Americans, a story of Black Americans crying for mercy, yelling, "Mama, mama," in a nation that suffers from racial deafness. Yet today, as we remember the wrong inflicted upon George Floyd, we are seeing yet another disheartening video of the brutal murder of Ronald Green by state troopers in my home state of Louisiana. We watched as Mr. Green was kicked, stepped on, and punched repeatedly. We saw him lasered multiple times, hands cuffed, ankles shackled, and then drugged to his death. As he was being dehumanized, he was recorded pleading for his life, pleading, "I am scared. I am your brother." As his life was being taken away, Ronald Green was being cursed with hateful words. To each of us today, the murder of George Floyd, Ronald Green, and a list of other Black men and women is the reality we are living in this nation we all love. What we are seeing on these videos is the truth we must not continue to deny. It is a call for the racial healing we so desperately need. It is urging the transformation we must undergo if we are to preserve our increasingly fragile democracy. The truth we are seeing is urging us to examine our conscience. So let us ask ourselves and our nation, what is lacking in our hearts and so void in our humanity that some of God's children feel so empowered to be so blatantly inhumane to other children of God? In a nation structured around the false ideology of white supremacy, I dare to ask, Do most Americans truly believe in the concept of liberty and justice for all? Do we believe in the concept of equal rights and equal justice? Do we accept the truth of our one humankind? Do we believe in the God-given dignity of all people? Or have we lost? Have we lost our capacity to love and respect one another as sisters and brothers? With this, allow me to share an embarrassing story that may help us face our nation's history. During the mid-'80s to mid-'90s, I spent several weeks a year in South Africa. I represented Kellogg Company in our efforts to support the Sullivan Principles and the dismantling of apartheid in that country. During one trip, I met a man named Clyde Derby Lewis at his home, not so far from Johannesburg. Mr. Lewis was a high-ranking Afrikaner. The South African media had described him as a right-winged racist extremist. As he sat in the living room, he and I sipping tea, I was debating the South African apartheid system, telling him how inhumane it was, as he was giving me an unfiltered lesson in American history. I will never forget how Clyde Derby Lewis looked squarely into my eyes as he very politely and very respectfully said, "Mr. Stewart, how can you Americans come here and criticize South Africa for our way of life?" He went on to say, "As you can see, we simply model our apartheid system of segregation after your US system of segregation and racism." He said, "In the beginning, America created Indian reservations and slave quarters for your Native and Black people. We used your model, and we simply created townships for Black and Asian South Africans. When you finally allowed Blacks and Native Americans to read, you created separate and unequal schools. We created Bantu education in South Africa." He went on to say, "Do you realize that America was established in 1784, yet Black Americans in many states were not allowed to vote for some 180 years afterwards?" The more Clyde Derby Lewis talked, and he did, the more embarrassed I felt. The more I felt like my so-called American dream was not much more than a mere whitewash. To close this story of my lesson in American history, less than 2 years after this meeting, a shocking headline popped on my TV screen in Michigan. It read, "Clyde Derby Lewis has been arrested for the murder of Chris Haney, a young Black leader," end quote. Mr. Lewis died in 2016 of cancer after serving more than 22 years in a South African prison. And it is not just South Africa that found inspiration and justification in our history, in our US history. When Isabel Wilkerson released her book, Caste, a lot of Americans were shocked to learn that even Nazi Germany was based on the horrors of American racism. She wrote that Hitler saw the US Immigration Restriction Act of 1924 as a model for his program of racial purification. And the Nazis were deeply impressed by the American custom of lynching Black Americans. She noted that Hitler especially marveled at the American, quote, "knack for maintaining an air of robust innocence in the wake of mass death." So yes, the horrors of Nazi Germany and the oppression of apartheid in South Africa were both inspired by what they saw in our dear America. Think about that. Why these stories? Why have I told these stories? Well, when I was taught American history by Clyde Derby Lewis, I was not aware that my ancestors had been owned and sold by a religious organization in my country that had made their slavery legal. I share these stories to emphasize that there has long been the need for truth, transformation, and reconciliation in America. Descendants of those enslaved and today's successors of the Jesuits enslavers believe the partnership we've created is bringing forth a new pathway forward. We hope you will find hope in our vision. And with this introduction, I am pleased to turn to our Jesuit partner, Father Timothy Kaseki. Over the past 4 years, I've come to know this man as much more than a Jesuit leader, a partner, and a priest. I have come to see, accept, and respect him and several other Jesuit leaders in the U.S. as our brothers and partners in a shared commitment to transformation in God's one human family in our nation. So please welcome Father Tim Kaseki.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Thank you, Joe. And I think I want to begin by talking about the day I first met Joe and his wife, Clara Stewart. They had written the Superior General, Mr. Stewart and others had written the Superior General in Rome, asking him to send a visitor to the United States to begin the process of reconciling with this tragic sin of Jesuit slaveholding. Some of you may say, what is a Jesuit? Maybe I should start there. I am Tim Kaseki, a Catholic priest, a member of the Jesuit order. And the Jesuits are a Catholic order in the church founded in 1540 by St. Ignatius Loyola. The names Ignatius and Loyola are connected to many institutions now in the United States, but that's what a Jesuit is. What we don't celebrate is the fact that we were part of the system of slaveholding in the United States, even the domestic slave trade having sold 272 souls in 1838. Mr. Stewart and others wrote the head Jesuit in Rome asking, how are you going to respond to this tragic history? It was only in 2016 that he learned that his own church, the church that baptized him, had held enslaved and sold his ancestors. And he and others began the very painful struggle to try to both understand this past and to seek reconciliation, transformation, and action on behalf of the Jesuits and the church. In the letter that the Superior General wrote to Mr. Stewart, he copied me. And Mr. Stewart found me, called me, and invited him to his home. I flew to Battle Creek, Michigan from Washington, D.C., where I live. When I approached the home, the first thing that he and his wife, Clara, did was they handed me something we use in the church called holy water. We use it for blessings. And he handed me holy water and he said, would you bless my home? And I did. But as I held that holy water, I couldn't help but think that 200 some years ago, another Jesuit poured holy water on Isaac Hawkins, his ancestor, and then later sold Mr. Hawkins to plantations in Louisiana. As I held that holy water, I wondered, do I bless this now as a house of God, which binds me to this family? Or do I sprinkle the holy water and walk out and return to the life I've always known? And from that moment began a relationship that has grown into a partnership, that has grown into a vision which we believe can be transformative for the United States. I had apologized for the sin of Jesuit slaveholding at Georgetown University in 2017. And in that apology, I said, we resist moving on, but embrace moving forward in hope. But I did not know how to move forward. My own shame and crippling fear prevented me from the next step to take. It wasn't until I met Mr. Stewart and many other descendants who invited us first into a relationship and then a formal dialogue process sponsored by the Kellogg Foundation, in which we followed a vision imagined by the descendants of Jesuit slaveholding. They came to us and said, we don't want to beat you up about your past, but we are going to beat you up about your future. We believe that the moral response to the history of slaveholding is a partnership, and we want you to partner with us in a foundation, a charitable foundation whose primary foci are racial healing in this country, the educational opportunities of descendants, and care for the impoverished, elderly, and infirm descendants. There were three dynamics of the partnership which I'd like to highlight because I think these speak of a new path for reconciliation in this country. The first was they said, we want this partnership to be descendant-led. The history of Jesuit slaveholding isn't a secret. Much has been written about it. But it wasn't until we met living descendants that we embarked on this path. It's also safe to say we didn't run to the descendants at first. It was only when they invited us that we said yes. They challenged us, follow us, partner with us, don't embark on your own project or program. And we came to the fundamental understanding that they could lead us out of racism. The second thing was that it had to be an equal partnership. The descendants said, look, we know that you Jesuits in your institutions have a strong tradition of faith and justice in the United States, and we don't want you to stop that work you're already doing. But don't just continue your own charity and your own existing initiatives. Unless we are equal partners in a new vision, what will change? We're not only creating a new foundation, but a model of unity and partnership. The third thing that they shared with us is this needs to be bold, innovative, and sustainable. And they said, we want a $1 billion vision, a $1 billion foundation, which is bold. And money is a big part of it, but not the only part of it. I think the boldest part of it is it's not so much building a school or another brick and mortar institution. Rather, it's building an investment in people. This partnership between descendants of the enslaved and descendants of the enslavers is indeed a new pathway forward for a country plagued with much racial unrest. And a trust in foundation whose assets will grow won't just serve one generation, but it will serve many generations. I recently read the New York Times bestseller, The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And her concluding chapter is titled The Solidarity Dividend. She calls for a national effort rooted in a community that brings us together. She then highlights how truth, racial healing, and transformation can be the model for such a process. This is the model the Kellogg Foundation used in helping our dialogue. It brings representative people from across the country, and the framework involves a process of relationship building, the healing of shared personal stories. But it doesn't just lead to conversation about race, it leads to transformation. This is the framework that the descendants and the Jesuits have used over the past 3 years. And this is our vision, our commitment to transformation. We believe that investment in this foundation, to which the Jesuits have deposited 15 million, have pledged to raise 100 million through Jesuit networks, and will further partner with the descendants on seeing the $1 billion foundation actualized, is a very positive, bold, and hopeful step forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you both, not only for the inspiring words this morning, but for the incredible work that you have undertaken. It requires patience and courage, and all the best of the human values that we have. Mr. Stewart, you have a long history of working with foundations in America, and there is considerable critique about the role of philanthropy in perpetuating some problematic issues. Talk to us a little bit about the goal of the foundation, how you made a decision to go this route with making restitution, if you will, or repairing relationships through the work of the foundation, rather than, particularly since the Jesuits were excellent at keeping records, you know who the descendants are, rather than making more direct kinds of investments in the people. You want the foundation to serve a broader purpose. What was the thought process behind that?
Well, we started out as Descendants making a very important strategic decision. We decided that a price had already been put on the heads of our ancestors, and that we would not yet put another price on them for our selfish benefit, our individual benefit, but that they did have, and we would hold them to a responsibility to invest forward in our descendants, but more importantly, to invest in attacking the systemic institutions that are barriers now to human uplifting. The foundation concept is simple. This situation we're in is 400 years old. We're not going to get out of it next week. So we needed an institutionalized approach to transformation. And we needed time and investment and a proportionate, significant investment. And the best way to do that and to sustain it for 100 years was to create, number one, an irrevocable trust where only the returns from the assets would be invested in annual programming. So with a model, the intent, the beginning intent, if I can just use as a sample, Father Koseki's reference to the $1 billion, that vision to us, when actualized, would produce $50 million a year. That $50 million would go to educate descendants to fight against the continuation and unmitigated impact of the legacy of slavery and racism in this country. And it was for those reasons that we chose the foundation approach. We could not envision a one-time, that's it approach to transformation in this country. We needed a long-term sustainable approach.
Thank you. Father Tim, often in the American psyche is this notion of individualism and not being connected to institution or anything beyond oneself. And you certainly were not a slave owner. Your family, whenever your family came into this country from their own countries of origins, probably came too late to be slave owners. But yet you take ownership of this issue. You apologize on the behalf of the institution that you work with for something that you had nothing to do with. Tell us how that works.
Yes, we spent some time looking at this question, and the first thing I would say is it's true. No one living today was held enslaved or held anyone enslaved, but some benefited, and the Jesuit order clearly benefited from slavery. And I've been a member of the Jesuit order now for 38 years, and while I can't directly trace that history to the education I received as a Jesuit, the formation I received as a Jesuit, this passes on from generation to generation. We know trauma passes on through generation. Having experienced Catholic descendants who feel the betrayal of a church, having enslaved and sold their ancestors, how could I, a descendant of those who helped enslave them through my membership in the Jesuit order, how could I not feel that pain and that trauma? You know, a year ago today, and this is significant, a year ago today, many Jesuit institutions were wondering what our statements were going to be in response to the death of George Floyd. And while I said, I believe statements are important and sometimes we need to issue them, I said, the true statement the Jesuit order can make in response to racism in the United States is reconciling with our history of slaveholding. I believed that a year ago. I believe that even more strongly now. And so it's true that I was not born into a family that had direct connections to this history. I have been a member of a church and a religious order that do have direct connections to this history. And as a church committed to mercy, justice, and reconciliation, I believe this is the best way forward.
Appreciate those remarks. Mr. Stewart, there's a lot of words, a lot of conversations that have happened over the years, a lot of race conversations. I've been a part of many of them for the last 40 years myself. It gets very discouraging that there does not seem to be connection from works and conversations and learnings to actions. In one of our prep conversations for this call, you made a point to say to me, it was the Descendants who initiated this action. And action is the key to moving forward. Understanding, of course, and knowledge and accepting the truth is critically important. What advice do you have for people who are seeking action? Where do they start? How do they start? What would you have them do? Because this was a very interesting and innovative way of going about one aspect of restitution, if you will. Talk to our audience a little bit about things that you think people should be doing to make actions happen.
Let me tie my answer to that, or my attempted answer to that, Tony, to the conversation you and Father Kosecki just had about when people came to the country and whether or not they were here during slavery or held slaves. The reality now is that those are all facts about the past, but we got a future we have to build. And if we don't build it together, it will never be as strong as it was envisioned to be. What does that mean? It means that whether you held a slave or not, whether you sold a slave or not, you're reaping benefits from that era. You're reaping the benefits of slavery in this country. And that is undeniable. You see the disparities between Black and white in this country. You see the situations with the George Floyd. And on an individual level, on a decent man of goodwill, woman of goodwill, you have to accept the fact that you have a responsibility to change the conditions that create the disparities. And so it isn't that you don't need to create a foundation, but you can create a commitment to change. You can have a commitment to confronting wrong when you see it. And right from wrong is such a simple concept in the human family. We all pretty much know about it. You have renegades who do whatever they want to, but we know basically the difference between right and wrong. Then on an individual level, admit what the realities are and stand up for changing what's wrong about it. You don't need a pattern from someone else. Use the goodness in your own heart to confront what's wrong and be a part of making it right.
You know, Mr. Stewart, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that because, I sent you a question that I'm going to ask you in advance, because we talk about, and you talk so eloquently about the change that is needed is in the individual heart, right? And of course that is true. but organizing those individual hearts that have been converted to actually have power to stand up against the systems that have been created seems to be a bit of a stretch, right? And so when you have people whose hearts have been converted and they stand up to do the right thing individually, there is more power in even what you've done. You know, you've organized these people to come together and in an organized way do something. So I think that there is a message for our audience that there is power in joining forces with organizations or with people who want to do this same work. Would you agree with that, or do you think this is more of an individual change of heart thing?
The nation is made up by individuals, but it's collectively action that's been taken to set up change in institutions. That sounds a little bit convoluted, so let me try and be more specific about what I mean. Going back to the point that we know what's right or wrong, we know what privileges we're talking about, we see the disparities. And I can guarantee you, of the people sitting in this audience, the vast majority of them would want to do something to bring about change. Then find the place where you can have the impact. Every man, woman alive can have an impact. You have to, number one, be committed to wanting to do it. You have to overcome the fear of what those around you who don't want change will impose upon you. But change will never take place without the commitment of people to change. And I often relate that we brag as a nation about being so innovative. You hear people, America can do anything it wants to do. Well, then I challenge America to make things right in God's one human family. I challenge America to be committed to justice and equality for everybody, to not just stand there and let things continue to be when you see the suffering that is causing some.
Father Kozecki, can you comment a little bit on this? You know, it is unusual. I'll be very honest with you both. It is unusual for me to have a conversation with social venture partners being represented where we're talking about morality and religion and God. So bear with me a little bit. But I certainly understand that the word philanthropy in its very root is the love of humankind, right? It is the love of people. So when we exercise that love, we are elevating all of us to a higher moral level. But it is one thing, you know, for when somebody steals my property, for them to apologize for it, right? That's nice. That's a nice thing to have done. But it's much more effective when they return the property to me, right? And so there is a tradition of, if you will, a religious tradition that some restoration must go along with forgiveness. How do you talk about that and think about that, both for people to do individually? How do you enter into that? And then to keep this conversation going about how do you influence collectively to stand up to these very entrenched systems that oppress people?
Yes. So when we look at, say, for example, the relationship between justice and charity, I remember once teaching this in high school, actually, the difference, and saying how justice entailed obligation, charity was a free will giving of your heart. And a student raised his hand and said, but if you ought to act charitably, is it not all justice? And I think that in many Christian traditions, the call to justice rooted in the gospel, rooted in the Old Testament is very clear. Churches often use the term restitution, that sometimes one simply cannot pay back something that's centuries old, or that one doesn't have as direct a connection to, but restitution is called for. And it's about transformation, it's about change, it's about restoring, it's about recognizing ourselves as equal before God. And then we're called to do something greater than ourselves, to get out from our own immediate vision and circumstances to be part of something greater. Ultimately, churches call people together to assemble, to see themselves as, we use the image, the body of Christ, as something bigger than ourselves. And when we see ourselves as part of something larger, we're called to act in that regard. And so I understand individualism and why someone might say this isn't part of me, but certainly from a faith tradition, faith is practiced in communion, and that's communion with others.
Father Tim, you are a member of an organization, I think that, I don't know the statistics, but is predominantly led by white men, I would presume. And do you feel like you have the support of the institution to do this work?
It's just an interesting anecdote that when I first learned of the Living Descendants, I was actually at a meeting of Jesuit provincials in Africa and Madagascar. And I can assure you, they were very interested in how I would respond. But in the United States and in much of the Western world, the Jesuit order is under the influence of white men, including our superiors general over the years. And there is amongst the US provincials, who are the leaders in the United States, great support for this work. And I would say, especially amongst a lot of younger Jesuits, but across the spectrum, there's great support for this work. But with support also comes fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which I think dedication, hard work, and faith will help us to overcome.
Mr. Stewart, I have Social Venture Partners has led some initiatives here locally, some initiatives that are collaborative, and we've attempted to work on some projects with bringing different organizations together for a common good. That work is extraordinarily hard. I can't even imagine how difficult it has been to bring what you have attempted this far along. What were some of the obstacles that you had to overcome to get to this level of success so far?
Well, Father Kaseki, well, you said the Jesuits is a bureaucracy. It's a religion, but it's a bureaucracy as much as our federal government is. It is controlled by older white men. Now, we could look at that and think that the problem was insurmountable, or we could have a commitment to take it head on. And we did. We did with the belief we had an answer, not just for us, but for them as well. Because for the sin they committed, they needed atonement. And by taking the morality route, we were able to challenge them to be what they say they are. And it was not an easy journey. It took us 3, almost 4 years now. But I'll go back to the one word that I used. You got the one, want to, you got to be 2, be committed to, and 3, you got to stick to. And so that's all that happened here. And through this process, the process of truth, racial healing, and transformation, that the Kellogg Foundation gave us the outside expertise to engage one another. And we went through the process. And coming out of that process, we were able to sign a memorandum of understanding about the future. And we've converted that memorandum into a fully living foundation. And it's through that we will travel the pathway to change in over the next years to come.
I am struck by the role of leadership as I listen to you speak, and just reading a little bit about your own personal career and your accomplishments with the foundation and with your career. You are certainly considered to be an extraordinary leader. And Father Tim, your own leadership is evident within your own community and within the United States. What do you say to leaders, corporate leaders, religious leaders? Mr. Stewart, what is your advice to leaders in our community about moving this conversation forward? Father Tim, there we go. Go ahead, Mr. Stewart.
No, were you asking me? I'm sorry, I thought you were asking Father Tim.
Apologies, that you first. What's the role
Okay,
of
please, could you kind of repeat that for me to get me focused? I was so focused on Father Kosecki, I thought you had thrown him a hard ball, so I wanted him to hit at it.
I switched it up. I asked you the follow-up question. So you were right.
Okay.
I normally would have gone to Father Tim.
Okay.
I was talking about the role of leadership and acknowledging the role of corporate leaders and religious leaders. What would you say to them? What is their role? What advice would you give to there are leaders of corporations on this call right now. What would you say to them about their role in this conversation?
I have a tendency, number one, I kind of reject the leadership reference you gave to me. I just believe what I believe, and I'm committed to try and do it. I don't know whether you call that leadership, but that's all I think I bring to the table. I don't bring a lot of sophistication. You know what I mean? I don't have a lot of great credentials, but I do have a lot of experience that I've been afforded in my lifetime. And I'm willing to put and have put all of it on the table because you see, go back to my simplistic approach. You're able to see right from wrong. And most of us see it, and we don't have the will and the commitment to do anything about it because it's not comfortable all the time. This has not been a comfortable journey for me. It hasn't been one for Father Kosecki, and the journey won't be easy for anybody who decide they want to make a difference. That this way that we have is not the right way forward. We can't continue to go the way we're going. We have to deal with the racialized institutions and the negative impact of racism on all of us. White America, though they may be privileged, have as many shackles around their humanity as was placed on the humanity of my ancestors. And it's known, it's shame, it's a lack of something missing. And I'm saying, whatever privileges you may think you're enjoying, those privileges don't have to be taken from you in order for you to know it's right that others have the same privilege. And Tony, to me, I don't like to put it under the umbrella of, it's just the ability to know right from wrong and be committed to doing something about it. That may be overly simplistic, but I got to tell you, I've existed for 20 some years at the highest levels of corporate America. I have not seen one time something a CEO wanted to do that was not done. I have seen organizations held accountable, but they had to be held accountable by the top. So any CEO who tells me about how difficult it is to do something, I lose a little bit of the respect for a man with power to change that won't make a commitment to change.
Father Tim, how about you?
You know, I think we've all heard the adage, failure is not an option. And that's a sign of a strong leader. Failure is not an option. Sadly, I think when it comes to reconciling with slaveholding and certain issues involving race, failure can be an acceptable option. I can't tell you how many organizations or conversations I've been part of where I hear, look, you've gone as far as you can go. There's nothing more that can be done. And what I love about the Descendants vision is it's bold. Am I nervous? Yes, especially since my future is going to be working on capitalizing this trust and foundation. But I don't think failure can be an option here. And I think that's what leaders have to embrace, that there is a connection between our leadership, our history, and for organizations like mine, our direct involvement. And if we don't make this a priority, if this isn't as important as everything else we do, it's almost a cancer in the organization that could do even greater damage in the end. And so I hope failure isn't an option for us or for anyone who is serious about combating the history and the reality of race in the United States.
Thank you, Father. You know, here in Dallas, we have a Jesuit preparatory school, high school, and it is, you know, its reputation is stellar. And all over the country, you have Jesuit-run universities and high schools. Is this part of the curriculum? These men who go on to prestigious colleges and get into corporate America and be they're people of great influence, are they learning this stuff in the curriculum of their high schools and their college curriculums?
You know, Mr. Stewart shared that story from South Africa, and he used the word, it was embarrassing. And I share with a little embarrassment that from, as you said in my introduction, from 2000 to 2008, I was president of a Jesuit high school in Cleveland. And I don't know that this history was taught. It may have been, I don't know that it was. And that has changed now that we have come face to face with living descendants of our history. I know that conversations are actively happening now about how this history will be taught, and it has to be taught. But I think it's more now than just teaching history. I think it's building relationships. And, you know, I do dream of the day when everyone who is part of the Jesuit educational or parish structure has the opportunity to engage and know descendants and to see how we can grow to build something new.
Thank you.
Tony,
Yes, sir.
Tony, may I know we got a few minutes. Let me just say this. I want to go back and emphasize the presence of Father Kosecki here and where it came from. One of the first things that happened when the Descendants approached the Jesuits was that communications he referred to the Father General in Rome. And the letter that came back was the letter upon which we have built everything to this day. I'll quote the letter. The Father General said to me and the other descendants he responded directly to, "We have sinned against God and betrayed the dignity of your ancestors. And we have great concern about that ongoing and want to engage in dialogue about the way forward." I'm going back to the CEOs now and to every American and say, our nation has sinned against the dignity of our Native, our Black, our Brown, our Asian Pacific Islanders. Our nation has sinned against our humanity. And we need only face that and have the courage to change that. Let others enjoy the dream of America equally with all Americans. So I'll just share that thought as we near closing.
I appreciate that. Would you share with our audience some ways that they can support your work and the work of your foundation?
Yes, there are two ways. One very immediate. Father Kosecki mentioned he's in the process of capitalizing the trust. Go to our website, descendants.org, and consider whether or not you want to make a financial contribution. That's number one, because capitalization results in success for us and long-term sustainability. Number two, back to that individual level. Seek opportunities in your community to begin relationship with people that you have been isolated from. Understand that all of us basically have the same desires about the quality of life in America. We all want the same thing. So look at people who don't have it and support them in your own way anyway in pursuing justice and equality in America. Be a champion for justice and equality. Find a way to be a champion for justice and equality.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Father Kosecki, how has this last year since the murder of George Floyd, how has it changed you? Has it changed your work, influenced you to do things differently?
Well, I think clearly what we're remembering on today's anniversary and the loss of a human life for a church that is pro-life is always tragic. But that was one day in a history of racism. And I look at what preceded his death and the huge public outcry that came after his death as a realization of the work we still have to do in this country. And, there's often a temptation when we see news outlets and others discuss this to scapegoat or to say it's this problem or this person. And, I begin with the realization it begins with me and the racism that I was brought into, grew up in, and I'm sure still have vestiges of today, and how all of us have to embrace this challenge and make a commitment, I think, as Mr. Stewart has said, toward justice and equality.
Mr. Stewart, I know you've been at this work a long time. You started this project long before the death of George Floyd. What have you observed in this last year, and how have you been changed by it?
George Floyd's death is an opportunity for white America to really get its act together about race in this country and race relations. From my standpoint, I'll go back and refer to being a 78-year-old Black man in America. I come from a town where there were hangings in Louisiana. So the vision of George Floyd being brutally dehumanized is something that's been a part of my life's experience. I have seen that all of my life and understood it. And for that reason, the words of Ronald Green still rings with me. I'm scared. Most Blacks are scared. We're scared driving. We're scared going to a movie, and may need to be scared going to church. Fact is, we live in a country, I won't call it scared. We are cautious. And you better be cautious because of the reality around you. So on a personal level, what it has meant to me is the inspiration to see so many white Americans who have gathered a commitment to take a stand. The young white people in America that's been walking around with Black Lives, excuse me, please, with Black Lives Matter sign is a sign that men of goodwill in this country have reached a point where they too want to take a stand and stop some of the dehumanizing of other people. That is important to me, to see that vision.
Well, gentlemen, we are at the end of our hour, and I cannot express to you the depth of my gratitude that you would come and visit with Social Venture Partners and our audience here locally. I'm going to be bold, and I know you're getting you're going to get great acclaim in this work because it deserves it, and you both do as well. I'm going to ask you publicly, because you're going to get very famous and you're going to be talking to large national audiences. I'm going to ask you to commit to coming back at some time later in the year, and let's revisit this and see how progress is going and what more we can do to help your efforts in this really important work. But once again, thank you so much for being present with us here in Dallas today. On the website that you referred to, Descendants.org, there's an opening couple of sentences, and those sentences are really profound. Without healing, we cannot move forward. Without truth, we cannot heal. This is why we begin our story with the truth. Thank you for bringing a little bit of that truth to us today here in Dallas. I also want to invite our audience, if you're looking for ways to engage locally with these kinds of causes and issues, please consider joining Social Venture Partners in our work. I want to thank our sponsors today, Wright, Knatzer Law Firm, Something Good Consulting, and I want to give a special shout out to Christina Hanger, who is a partner at Social Venture Partners. She serves as the CEO here of a nonprofit in Dallas, and she serves as a trustee for the Kellogg Foundation. And so she was quickly very instrumental in connecting me to Mr. Stewart, and I am very grateful for that. So appreciate all of you, appreciate our audience for sticking with us. Thank you, gentlemen, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.